that necessarily true? No, you can be 6'9" and have long levers and move through the circle efficiently and throw pretty far, but it definitely helps. Jared Rome's a good example. He's a pretty big dude, throws pretty far. It increases both, well, force equals mass times acceleration. The nice part about strength training is it increases both those. It increases your mass through hypertrophy if done long enough, if done well, if allowed time to recover, have proper nutrition. And then it also increases acceleration through the same process that we talked about in the previous slide. Strength training theory, again, leads directly to ATP, CP energy system functioning. If it takes you more than 10 seconds to throw an implement, you might want to think about another event. I don't think that that's a good sign. It should be far less than 10 seconds. And then gains in strength, again, directly correlate to gains in performance. Here's the one that I think is kind of controversial, and research is even a little bit controversial, whether strength training helps distance runners. I strongly think that it does. I think where it does is not the hypertrophy. I think that's detrimental to distance runners, so I think that a designed strength training program for distance runners needs to be designed a little bit differently than it does for everybody else. But where it does help is if you can teach a distance runner how to power clean, or you can teach a distance runner how to squat well, you're teaching them how to move properly, you're teaching them where to put their body in space, you're teaching them how to move efficiently. And if you can, I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but if you can increase efficiency by 1% in the weight room, you extrapolate that over a mile, you're cutting a stride or 2 strides or 3 strides off a mile, and you're cutting some time off. Now, is it possible to train gains in strength and gains in endurance at the same time? That's somewhat controversial. I would say yes. I think we've had some pretty good results. I think if you look at Alan Webb here, I think you can see that he probably spends a little bit of time on some strength training. Is it in the weight room? Not necessarily, but is he doing general strength? Is he doing running hills? Is he doing that kind of stuff? Definitely. And so I think another part of distance running is it's training variety. I think that's a hard thing to do when you're trying to train a distance runner. Variation is the biggest thing within training. You don't want to be running 10 miles every day. You want to get some variety in there. I actually wrote my senior paper at the University of Minnesota on this topic, on dynamic strength training for endurance athletes, and one article that I read said that if you replace up to 35% of your volume with strength training, from taking it away from distance running, that it's actually has a synergistic effect, so it's better than if you don't do the strength training. And then injury prevention, joint strength, that kind of stuff is huge. Again, that's due to training variety and just strengthening your joints. And again, I gotta bang these home because these are the 2 most important things when putting together a strength training program. It has to be part of a larger program design. If you're out and you have a distance runner that you want to add strength and conditioning to, you can't tell them to go do their regular workout and then do 4 sets of 10 on the squat, because you're just adding volume. You're not making sacrifices elsewhere. You have to change things. You have to be willing to make sacrifices. Otherwise, you're going to look like this guy and be overtrained. And again, there's no substitute for supervision. 1, it provides accountability. 2, it provides proper movement, or an opportunity to teach proper movements. And then also, I think one thing that I didn't put on this slide, but has been huge in our program, is it allows you an opportunity to get to know your athletes better. It allows you an opportunity to figure out how to motivate your athletes better. Just the more time you can spend with them, learning their psychology and their physiology is going to help you as a coach on an individual basis with each athlete, and looking at the difference between men and women, looking at the difference between 800 runners and milers, 800 runners, shot putters. Just learning the differences and spending time with your athletes, I think, is huge. Obviously, it's more time. There's only 24 hours in a day, so you got to figure out how to, when to do it and how to do it. Training principles, so program design. Overload is strength training, adding more stimulus than before to try and get your body to adapt to it. Again, these notes are on there, so I'm not going to hit every point on here. Variation is the most important thing. You can't do the same thing every time. You have to vary things. You have to change loads. You have to change reps, sets, rest time, all that kind of stuff. Same as you do on the track. You're not running 8 200s every day. You're not running 8 200s every Tuesday. You're changing that stuff up to try and get them to their body to have to adapt to something different. Specificity. The weight room is very specific to track and field. Triple extension movements like your power cleans, even double extension like your squats. Ground force development. If you take a graph of where force is applied in a sprint, it's almost always applied in a vertical direction. Even though you're moving forward, you apply force directly into the ground, which is exactly the same as you do in a squat. You push straight into the ground. So it's very, very similar to the movements of the sprints. How similar do you want to get? Do you want to do some single leg stuff? I would say no, because the weight room serves a purpose. It improves ground force development. If you start doing some single leg power cleans, step ups and stuff are okay, but some single leg, really complicated movements, you're taking away from the total amount of force developed, and you're not working what you want, what the weight room serves. So I think pretty basic strength training, squats, cleans, squat jumps, bench press is really all you need, especially within a 13-week season, to see some pretty incredible gains. Reversibility is the removal of training stimulus that causes physiological adaptations to return to baseline values. One reason I put this on here is there's a lot of research going on these days that shows that reversibility is very different between men and women. Women's curve is much steeper, so research is beginning to show that for women you want to train them closer to a section meet or closer to the state meet hard before you start to cut back, whereas men you can cut back and they keep their gains a little bit longer than women do. That's based on their hormone profiles and that kind of stuff. That's probably the biggest difference, I would say, between genders, that and the psychology of motivation, which I won't get into because I haven't figured that out yet. I coach men and women. I haven't figured out how to motivate my men or my women, so I'm working on that. Building the program, periodization, I think, is a pretty, I don't know if it's a well-known concept, but I think even if you don't know the term, you guys do a lot of this anyways. It's just trying to get your training to peak at a specific time, reach specific performance goals, and programming is the creation of the actual programs, whether it's on the track or in the weight room within periodization. Goals of periodization: reduce overtraining and fatigue, maximize specific training adaptations, and elevating performance at a specific time. Goals of periodization are met by using variation. Again, that's an important key. Building the training program. Long-term plan, I think, is huge, and way that most people set it up, most people that actually do one, it's 4 years usually, whether that's based on the Olympic year or your freshman to your senior year. I think it's pretty important. I think if you can be as detailed as possible, that definitely helps. You'll have an idea of what's going on, and then you'll be able to make variations as on the way. Annual plan, again, very important. Trying to figure out, depending if they're in 1 sport, 2 sports, 3 sports, 4 sports if they're doing something in the summer, or if they're just a track athlete, if there's an indoor season that they want to peak at, if they want to peak at the state meet and then they want to try and go on to US Juniors, you got to figure out, talk with your athletes. I think, how many people in here know their high school meet schedule already? So I think looking at that now and starting, whether it's an annual plan or going through your macro cycle, is really important to get that high school schedule as soon as possible, and putting together a weightlifting schedule based on that is super important. Meets that don't matter as much, maybe you can hit a hard lift the day before, but meets that are important, you'll want to give a day or 2 days rest in between. Then we go to macro cycle, which is what we'll talk about today, 12 to 15 weeks, so basically your high school season or a singular sports season. It's broken down one step. I missed the preparatory phase, competitive phase, transition phase. Those are tough in high school when you have 3 or 4 sport athletes. You don't get a lot of time to spend in those phases, so you got to kind of work with your strength and conditioning department, work with the other sport coaches to try and figure out what they've done. You go to a macro cycle, then a mesocycle. This is kind of European talk. 2 to 6 week cycle, usually around a month, just trying to break it down into more specific goals. Microcycles, 5 to 10 days, usually a week, and then your training session is that day, or you can have multiple training sessions within a day. Components of traditional periodization, especially in the technical events, but really any physical activity, you want to be as prepared as possible before you start competing. So that's the goal of periodization, is to get an athlete prepared for technical competition. General towards specific, general strength, long sets, high reps, low weight, high volume to low volume, low intensity to high intensity. Volume and intensity are always inversely related. You can't be super intense at very high volume, otherwise you're going to get overtraining, you're going to be overstimulated, and you're going to struggle. And then the goal is 1 to 3 competitive peaks per year of traditional periodization. There are some other theories out there, conjugated load, some of that kind of stuff. I don't like to use that stuff. I think the more simple you can be, especially when you have a kid who's probably playing AAU basketball, who's probably doing some other stuff, even in college. I mean, with a college athlete, they got 2-3 hours of class a day, they got practice, they got extracurricular activities, they're probably not behaving all that well on the weekends. So trying to get real complex with this stuff If you're a high-level athlete who's trying to train for the Olympics, that's a little more feasible then. But with a high school and college athlete, I have a tendency to try and keep it as basic as possible. General adaptation syndrome, or GAS, is what we're trying to fight here with traditional periodization. So it's developed by Hans Siel. And stage 1 is alarm, so when a stimulus is added, your body reacts and tries to fight against it, usually takes a dip in performance. Then you get into resistance or adaptation. If the stressor persists, so if you continue to strength train, your body hopefully will start to adapt to it or resist it if it's too much, start to sink even lower. And then stage 3 is exhaustion. All the body's resources are depleted, and you basically shut down and you can't fight that stimulus anymore. So the goal of periodization is to avoid stage 3, accomplished by variation, exercise, selection, volume, intensity, and sufficient use of recovery methods. There's a lot of different recovery methods out there. One thing that I'll talk about a little bit later, chocolate milk, I think is probably the cheapest, best post-workout recovery drink that you can get a hold of, and I think most kids like chocolate milk. This is just a graph of what general adaptation syndrome looks like. Hopefully, at least, this is the goal. So these could be anywhere from your microcycles to your mesocycles or your macrocycles, depending on how long the season is and what your goal is. But basically, here's the introduction of the stressor. Your body goes into alarm, starts to adapt. Right before it starts to come back down is when you want to take away the stressor or bring in a new stressor. Usually just take it away, let it recover a little bit, then intro a new stressor.